For the second week in a row, a VR developer has announced its shutdown. Archiact, the makers of Doom 3 VR, Freediver Triton Down, and most recently Journey to Foundation, will be closing up shop in 2 weeks. I'm live open mic, let's talk about it. It sucks to have to talk about stuff like this, it does, but I think there's such a thing as toxic positivity, especially in the VR community, where people will just focus on the positive stuff and like get hype about games and things like that, and stuff like this tends to get glossed over. The closure Ready at Dawn was another thing that was in the news cycle for, I don't know, maybe half a day, and then people were back to talking about Batman and Alien Rogue Incursion and all that. And I'm not blaming gamers for that. It's perfectly fine to be excited about a game that's coming out soon, but I think news like this tends to get overlooked sometimes, so I do want to call it out when I see it. If you're not familiar with Archiact, in VR they did the VR version of Doom 3, they did Freediver Triton Down. If you never played Freediver Triton Down, you play as a freediver who is someone that can just hold their breath underwater for a very long period of time without using an oxygen mask, and you were trying to escape from a sinking ship. It's a fairly short experience. I beat it in about 20 minutes or so, but it was a lot of fun and it was something unique to VR. The most recent game, Journey to Foundation, was based off the Apple TV series, but is set in a different time period. Reading the statement here from Archiact, this is directly from their LinkedIn feed. Archiact's journey is coming to a close. On August 12th, we informed the staff that the studio will close in 2 weeks. And what an amazing journey it's been. Founded in 2013 as a pioneer in VR, Archiact's been dedicated to the development of immersive reality games. The studio published over 35 games, partnered with the most important companies in the industry, and pushed the possibilities of virtual reality and mixed reality. Most importantly, it served as a home over the years to hundreds of talented developers. They believed in the power of games and the promise of immersive reality, and they believed in one another and all of the players they touched. Thank you to everyone who made this journey possible. Now, Archiact was a fairly large studio. From what I understand, it was over 100 people, which is very, very large for a VR team. And Journey to Foundation was a very ambitious project. They hired a ton of voice actors for this. They actually have a really good dev series on their YouTube channel if you want to see all the complexities that went into making a game like that. But sadly, it just looks like the game just did not catch on sales wise. If you just look at review count, the game first launched on Quest and PSVR 2. It later got a PCVR port. On Quest, it's sitting at 104 reviews on the store, which is a very, very low number for the Quest store. On PlayStation VR 2, it's at 153 on the PlayStation store. And on Steam, it's sitting at a mere 22 reviews, which is a scary low number. So just going off of those, and if you go off the rule of 30, which is you get 1 review for every 30 people who bought the game, and just do the math on that, that's pretty low sales, unfortunately. Now, I don't think the lack of success of the game was like a failure on Archiact's part, for instance, in terms of like their marketing at least. It was featured on the Sony State of Play at one point. Meta had it featured on all of their social media when they first announced it. The trailer was on Sony and Meta's YouTube channel. It actually got picked up by IGN as well. And then when the game came out, most of the bigger creators covered it. I live streamed the entire game on YouTube and Twitch. This was the Quest version of the game before they went through their Quest 3 update. So I don't think this was a lack of visibility on the effort on marketing on their part. If you look at some of the stuff that went around on Reddit, especially on the PSVR forums, there are people just saying don't buy it. And unfortunately, bad word of mouth can tank any good marketing campaign. There were multiple AAA studios that will spend hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars on their marketing campaigns for a game. But if the player word of mouth and the user review scores are low, that will just tank the game entirely. There are tons of AAA games, even in the last year alone, that fall prey to this, like Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, for instance. Now, me personally, as someone who loves story-based narrative games and wants more of them in VR, this really buzzed me out because I really appreciated what Archiact was actually trying for here. Instead of making a big rawr action game, they were trying to tell like a deeper story, way deeper and way more intricate than you would typically get in a VR game. I cannot tell you the number of VR games I've played where you just walk around this isolated environment and the only person you interact with is this disembodied voice, because it is costly resource wise to animate another NPC to be right there alongside you, especially if you're animating humans, because humans are the hardest things to animate in games because we all know what humans look like. So you see games like hiding behind suits and things like that, so you don't have to see their faces, because their faces are usually the worst looking parts of any human in any game. Whereas with Journey, Archiact really went for it. There were tons of NPCs in the game, tons of people to talk to, and conversations actually matter because the choices that you made in your conversations informed the rest of the game and like how certain characters felt about you. So I thought it was a really ambitious project in scope. Unfortunately, the execution was lacking in other areas. The combat really wasn't that great, and there were some other issues like visually that they did go back and fix. They did the Quest 3 update to fix some of the Steam issues. On PCVR, the game looked loads better than what it looked like when it first launched on Quest. This shouldn't really be a surprise. Pretty much any PCVR game is going to look better than a Quest native game. but like the jump was pretty significant. And then they went back at this significant uptick for the Quest 3 update, which I thought also would look really, really good. Unfortunately, I think it was too little too late. And for every comeback story that you hear about in gaming, because people say this stuff all the time, well, games can come back. Look at No Man's Sky, look at Cyberpunk. For every one of those examples that you can name, there are dozens of games, if not hundreds, that unfortunately just never recovered from what turned out to be a bit of a shaky launch. And sadly, as we've seen with a couple of studios that closed in the last year or so, a really bad launch will actually tank your studio. This is getting to be endemic in the gaming industry. We saw record layoffs in 2023 and we're like, whoa, I hope we're past the worst of that. But it is August 13th, 2024, as I record this, just check my calendar, and we're already higher on layoffs in the gaming industry in 2024 than we were in all of 2023. We still have 4.5 months left in this year. Just in VR alone, looking at the list here, there was Archiact that we're talking about now. There's Secret Location, who made Nerf Ultimate Championship. There's Wiimote Games, who made Battle Bows and Micro Machines. There's actually a developer from that studio who I interacted with in the Rough Talk VR podcast Discord, and he said he hasn't been able to find work in the VR industry since Wiimote closed up shop. He's actually working in a different industry now. There's First Contact Entertainment. They're the ones who made Firewall Ultra and Firewall 0 Hour. They shut down after Firewall Ultra basically flopped on PSVR 2, blaming, among other things, a general lack of VR adoption. There's London Studios. Sony shut them down. They're the ones who made Blood and Truth, a very, very well-regarded PSVR 1 game. Ready at Dawn, we just talked about last week. Meta shut them down. They're the makers of Lone Echo 2, Echo Combat, Echo Arena. Echo Arena was shut down about a year and a half, I think a year ago at this point. And then one that most people didn't talk about because it's more of a social experience is Altspace. That was one of the first big social platforms that was out there, especially for like enterprise people. There were a lot of like business meetings in there. Altspace shut down last year. And that's not even getting into the companies that have gone through layoffs but haven't actually shut down. Like there's Downpour Interactive. That company is actually owned by Meta. They're the makers of Onward. Some of the people who were laid off from Downpour Interactive actually went off and made their own studio. They're making a new shooter called Tier 1. I saw a Kickstarter for that the other day. Supermassive Games, they're the ones who make the Dark Pictures anthology and The Quarry. In VR, they made Until Dawn Rush of Blood on PSVR 1 and Switchback VR on PSVR 2. They announced, I think shortly after Switchback came out, that they were going to go through a round of layoffs themselves, saying that they were trying to make their team more efficient, which efficiency pretty much is another word for we have too many people here we need to get rid of to shed the payroll. There's Digital Load, who made Espire 1 and Espire 2. Shortly after the MR missions, the mixed reality missions update came out for Espire 2, shortly after Quest 3 launched, Digital Load announced that they were laying off people from their studio out there in Australia. VR Chat went through layoffs. We did a whole episode dedicated to why VR Chat went through layoffs. I don't really entirely understand the mentality of that company, but unfortunately that led to some layoffs there. But I did a whole episode on that. There's some really good analysis and some articles that I referenced in that, so go check that episode out. ByteDance, the parent company of Pico, also went through a bunch of layoffs recently, and they actually canceled the Pico 5. Now, Pico is set to unveil their new headset called the Pico 4 Ultra, but if you talk to any developer in the last year, Pico pretty much completely cut off their funding for getting game studios to bring their games to their platform, I guess because ByteDance cut their purse strings at that point. ByteDance announced during the layoffs that Pico was going to go to a smaller team and they were going to be more focused on like hardware, and it felt like enterprise level stuff. So even though we're getting the Pico 4 Ultra, which looks like just a Quest 3 with more RAM, we'll get the specifics on that on August 20th when Pico does their event. They canceled their next line of headsets. So for all we know, Pico 4 Ultra might be their final headset, especially if it sells as low as the Pico 4 did. And then either last year or earlier this year, Microsoft laid off a bunch of people who were working on their HoloLens headset. So within VR, you're looking at, let's look through here, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 studios that shut down, 4 more went through layoffs, and then 2 major companies, ByteDance and Microsoft, went through layoffs. Meta also laid off more people, not related to Downpour Interactive and Ready at Dawn, but within their Reality Labs division, their division that works on like their glasses, their VR stuff, and their artificial intelligence stuff. So the industry as a whole is going through a ton, and it's just really depressing to see. And then there are companies who have made VR games and then just drifted out of it because the sales weren't really there. Ubisoft is a good example of this. They said they were scaling back their VR production after Assassin's Creed Nexus didn't sell up to their expectations. Again, I did a whole separate episode about that. Go back and check that one out. There's Turtle Rock Studios, who made Back 4 Blood. They actually made several VR games like the Two Face Shafirs games and Journey of the Gods. They have not made a VR game since Journey of the Gods, and that game's almost 3 years old now. The game director of Dead Second, on the week that Dead Second actually finally made it to the Meta Quest store after years and years and years on App Lab, just decided that he was burnt out from the process of trying to make it in VR and was looking for another opportunity outside of it. My best piece of advice for anyone wanting to enter the XR industry: don't, unless you are a solo dev. Right now there's just enough money in it for a talented solo dev to do well, but not nearly enough for full-size teams. Go indie or bust, folks. And then I weighed in on X because, again, this kind of bummed me out. And DSAX VR said something that actually got me to think. I said, one, I'm really enjoying my time with it, but I kind of understand Nathan's point. It looks costly, especially for a 100+ person studio, but the return is minimal for the IP. I say the VR audience isn't mature enough for a game like this to succeed, which is a shame. And then responding to something else I said to him later, from a business POV, is studios that live in game to game should keep teams lean and budget small. Underdogs and Dungeons of Eternity are a great example. Small teams, big ideas, polished product. And while I wanted to dismiss that out of hand, it actually got me thinking, because there are so many gamers who say, oh, we really want big budget IP in VR. We really want to see like big budget studios in VR. But I think what they want is all the companies that are already huge, like Naughty Dog and EA and Bethesda, to bring their franchises into VR, as opposed to a studio trying to scale up with like a nicest IP. You just look at the relative quote non-success of something like Assassin's Creed Nexus, go back and look at like the Stranger Things game, no one talks about that, the Attack on Titan that just launched in early access, and the kind of mixed response to that. Whenever we see big IPs come into VR, there's some reason for the letdown. There's always some caveat, some kind of excuse, with the exception of something like Saints and Sinners VR, and even that, the second game in that was actually crushed by gamers. A lot of people were not happy with that game, myself included. There are a lot of execution stuff there, but you see a big IP come to VR, and for some reason or another, it just doesn't connect with people. But aside from that example, and probably a better one would be Among Us VR, there's dozens of IPs and like Flat Culture or just flat screen IPs that came over to VR for some reason just did not really like grab people the way I think everyone was hoping. Even the Marvel game, Marvel's Powers United, that came from Sanzuru, they're the makers of Asgard's Wrath, that game ended up shutting down after about a year because again, it just didn't catch on with players. And I think there's an important lesson to be learned here. So I think the takeaway here, and I'm not going to pull away too far from like Archiact's closing, because again, that still sucks, and my thoughts are out to all the people who are going to be out of jobs here in 2 weeks. I'm questioning if big IP is the way forward in VR, because there are more examples of it not working than it working, in part because sometimes the games just really quite are up to like the standards of what VR players are looking for, and that could be anything from like genuine VR interactions or graphics or whatever. There's a bunch of different reasons, a bunch of different excuses. It varies game to game, but the end result largely tends to be the same. For every lone example of like an Alex or an Among Us VR or like a Saints and Sinners 1, there's probably 4 or 5 examples, if not more than that, of IP coming into VR that just didn't work. And the major takeaway, and this is something that gaming I think is learning in general, is that it's not okay to just license the IP and basically put out a good to average game. The game still has to be exceptional for players to catch on to it. Now, this isn't exactly breaking news, but it is a lesson that gets reiterated over and over and over again. There's going to be a lot of interest in Batman, in Alien, in Metro, specifically because of those names, but the game itself is just kind of meh. It's going to flop like a lot of these other games do. That's all I got to say about this one. Let me know how you feel about it. Let me know if you played Journey to Foundation and how you felt about it down in the comments. Wherever you heard this, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, iHeart, be sure to subscribe, and I'll catch you on the next one.